This is Forensic Talk with Jim Campbell. Is the Trump Organization a criminal enterprise? Is the investigation into Russian collusion in the election the wrong investigation? Is the President of the United States an unwitting asset of Putin's Russia? The untold story of Donald Trump and the Russian mob. That's tonight on Forensic Talk with Jim Campbell. Craig Unger is the author of the New York Times best-selling House of Bush, House of Saud. He is the former deputy editor of the New York Observer, editor-in-chief of Boston Magazine, a graduate of Harvard University. Hard-hitting investigation captured in his new book, House of Trump, House of Putin, the untold story of Donald Trump and the Russian Mafia. Welcome, Craig. How are you?
Very good, thanks. Thanks for having me.
Great. It's our honor. Let me start off with, Trump was always saying in the campaign, Russia, no loans, no deals, no nothing. And I guess there are no loans. As we'll go through, it's a cash kind of money laundering deal. Was he technically right by saying that, or is that just a blatant lie?
Yeah, I think it's really a lie. He said he had no contacts with Russia. I mean, that's ridiculous.
Yeah.
I found in the appendix, I have a list of 59 people who were intermediaries between him and Russia in various transactions. And a lot of those people are part of the Russian Mafia, and I think it's a very important and often overlooked part of the whole Trump-Russia scandal.
Is the Trump Organization a criminal enterprise?
Well, I'm not a lawyer, and I'm not making a forensic case, but I think a very strong case can be made that they have been participating in laundering money for the Russians for decades. And I start off in 1984 when Donald Trump himself meets with a guy named David Bogadin. And Bogadin is part of the Russian Mafia organization run by Semyon Mogilevich, who's really the financial genius behind the Russian mob. And Bogadin met with Trump and said, I'll take 5 condos, and he turned over $6 million in cash. That's back when the Trump Tower had just opened in 1983. It was the glitziest, most glamorous building in the world, and here Trump is showing that I believe that he loves doing business with gangsters, especially Russian Mafia, because they'll pay top dollar. They don't ask any questions. It's very simple. They pay top dollar because they're laundering their money.
1,300 of the 6,400 condos in the Trump Organization, you say, are linked to this kind of activity. That's 20%. Are those all you think Russian money laundering mob linked, or that's the whole list of anonymous LLC type of buyers?
It's the whole list of anonymous LLC buyers, but one does see a prevalence of Russians in that world. And for example, I started looking at Trump World Tower, and between floors 76 and 83, it's overwhelmingly Russian. If you go down to Trump, a lot of Trump-branded property in Florida, there's Sunny Isles, Florida. There are about 500 units there, and roughly a third of those are Russian. It's known as Little Moscow there. All the restaurants have their menus in Russian and so forth. So this is very widespread. It's not just Trump Tower on Fifth Avenue, his home base. And yet, if you look over a 35-year period, you see Russians there running money laundering operations, gambling rings, and so forth. They are working in Trump Tower. They are living there. They're running operations out of it there. And remember, he's the president of the United States. And I think one really, really important part of this that Americans often overlook is that when I talk about the Russian Mafia, they are an adjunct to Russian intelligence.
Yeah, that's really important because it's a lot different than our mafia, obviously.
Absolutely. And I mean, here, obviously, we're used to the old Italian-American mafia of The Godfather and so forth. And almost all those dramas have been fighting the FBI, fighting our government. It's the opposite in Russia. They are working with the government. It is a mafia state, and they are tied to Vladimir Putin. So you have, to me, it's just this extraordinary security breach with Russian agents really in Trump Tower, the home of the President of the United States.
Unbelievable. Let me ask you this now. Is this a case of willful blindness, which is not a legal defense, that Trump doesn't even ask enough questions, or he doesn't want to know?
Well, I think precisely that's exactly what a good prosecutor would argue. As I say, I'm not a lawyer, and when I mentioned earlier the David Bogatin transaction, and I can't read Trump's mind. I can't prove what he knew then. But when you realize this kind of transaction has happened at least 1,300 times, I think a good prosecutor would probably take the legal concept of legal blindness, willful ignorance, rather, willful blindness, and say, look, this isn't an accident. Trump is intentionally not asking the right questions about where the money came from, and he's done it not 5 or 6 times, but at least 1,300 times, and that constitutes a pattern.
Is this a major failure of the media? This stuff is hiding in plain sight. And also, if his taxes had been released, you would probably see a whole bunch of evidence along these lines. Why is this not a big deal?
Right. Well, yeah, exactly. I've been wondering exactly this, and I think it is. You know, a lot of these crimes in Trump Tower reported precisely as that, and they were on the crime pages of the tabloids like the New York Post and the New York Daily News and such. And I think understandably, when they were first reported, no one thought of them as having any really geopolitical consequence. This was just, there was gambling in Trump Tower. Isn't that bad? And it was reported like that. What I did that I don't think other people have done is I was looking not so much at the crimes themselves, but as the relationships between all the people in all the crimes. And again, I found them tied to this. I think he's a very powerful sort of mystery man, Semyon Mogilevich, the financial wizard behind the Russian Mafia. And that's not a coincidence. It happened again and again and again. So you can start to see it, I believe, as really almost an intelligence operation. It started off as a money laundering operation. The Russian Mafia got their money laundered. Trump sold his condos. Everyone was happy. But it grew and grew, and then as Trump became a man with a political future, then the Russians realized they had hit the jackpot.
It helps explain something to me. The Steele dossier, all that came out, and it appeared the Russians wanted to get their arms on Trump, and I'm thinking the guy, the night before the election, had a 15% chance of winning. So why were the Russians so interested in this guy? And it really probably traces back right to, you say they've been on him since 87 or 84 even.
Well, exactly. And I think it's, as I say, I think that initially they didn't necessarily see him as a man with political future when certainly in 1984 in the David Bogatin episode. But just three years later, he went to Moscow for the first time, and it really looked like this was an operation first to lure him there, because what happened was Ambassador Dubinin, who was ambassador to the United Nations, he and his daughter in 1987 just went up to Trump Tower without an appointment and met with Donald Trump, and they said how marvelous they thought Trump Tower was, and what it would be great if he could do something like that in Moscow. And they soon invited him over to Moscow for his very first trip. And one of the people I interviewed for my book was General Oleg Kalugin, who had been head of counterintelligence for the KGB. He now lives just outside Washington, and I interviewed him at his home. He said during that trip it was likely that the Russians had compromise on him. And mind you, this is not just some guy speculating. This is a guy who was head of counterintelligence for the KGB. He was actually Vladimir Putin's boss at one point, and I would assume he has a fair amount of institutional knowledge.
Do you think the Steele dossier then is credible?
I think it is credible. One thing, Steele himself, I believe, to be credible, and I interviewed someone who'd worked with him a lot and only had the highest regard for him. To me, I can't think of anything that has not been corroborated that has been refuted in it. Rather, there are things that have not been corroborated yet. But even some of the more unlikely things seem to me quite valid. That is, of course, there are famously allegations about Trump's sexual activities, and though I haven't corroborated the allegations in the Steele dossier, I have had other sources give me very similar accounts. And in addition, I think to me the most unlikely allegation in the Steele dossier does really have merit. And that was, when I first read it, I was sort of agog because it said that Trump had furnished intelligence to the Kremlin. In other words, that he's really acting as an agent for the Russians by turning over intelligence. And I thought that would seem kind of ridiculous when I first read it, because to be a real spy, you have to be highly disciplined and discreet. And those are two characteristics that I think do not describe Donald Trump.
There's a thing in there, too, that I find pretty amazing, which is that it was implied that Trump was eventually going to get 20% of the Russian oil company Rosneft in basically a bribe. And that seems incredible. I asked Bill Browder about that, and Browder didn't think that there's any way that could have been pulled off. Right.
Well, there was some confusion in my mind whether it was 20% or whether it was the brokerage fee for that, which still would have been something substantial. That is, I think 20% of Rosneft is one of the largest, like billions and billions of dollars.
Right.
But even a brokerage fee for that would have been enough to keep me going for the rest of my life, I'm sure. But to get back to to the Steele allegation that Trump was funneling intelligence to the Russians, it became a little clearer to me when I realized who was in Trump Tower and what kind of information they had. And so in 2002, it was the Russians who really brought Trump back to life. He had filed 6 bankruptcies. He was $4 billion in debt. And a new company opened in Trump Tower itself called Bayrock. It was a real estate development company, and with lots of ties to Russia and financing from the oligarchs. And they went to Trump and they said they made him an offer that he couldn't refuse, saying essentially, look, you don't have to do the real estate development.
Yeah.
We'll do that. We will finance it. We'll raise all the money. We just want to license your name. And in return for which he got very high royalty fees of between 18 and 25%. So that is how Trump became rich again.
Now we know that Trump will do anything for money and cash. It seems like. Is he unwitting how he's being used?
Well, that's a good question, and again, I say I still can't read his mind.
Yes.
But as I say, with the money laundering, if he's doing the same thing over and over again, 1,300 times those money laundering transactions, you got to figure he sort of knows what's going on. He has to. I mean, and his sons have been quite openly. We're getting our money from the Russians. We have an ordinance. Both Donald Jr. and Eric Trump have said that quite openly. You'll also can see how dramatically his ways of doing business happen. Trump has described himself as a king of debt, and look how clever he's been in filing bankruptcy and all that, and avoiding things, the liabilities. But suddenly, after 2002, he goes all cash. It's cash, 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 and the cash is coming from Russia.
And in fact, we should say that he was cut off by Wall Street and the banks.
Absolutely,
so
absolutely.
He needed money. Do you find the meeting of the Trump Tower, Donald Trump Jr., to me was a pure bait and switch, because I know a lot about Magnitsky and Browder, right? And that meeting is not then as bad as it really looks. It's getting a lot of attention in the collusion. It's really Trump's getting suckered, isn't it?
I don't think we know all the meaning behind it, but I think One is, if you know about Magnitsky, and you said you remember how that meeting was framed as being about adoption,
about dirt, and well, that's right. But it was they were told Donald Trump that it was a dirt on Hillary.
Right. But afterwards, Donald Trump Jr. said, "Oh, it was just about adoptions." Adoptions is a code word for lifting sanctions.
Yes.
Right, because that's what Putin put in a bill prohibiting the adoption of Russian children by Americans in response to those sanctions. But, there's a lot of stuff at that meeting that I think has not been unpacked yet. And, for example, one of the people there was a guy named Irakli Kavaladze. And he was, when his presence was revealed, he said he was there as a translator. Well, I happen to know that it's not the case. There was another translator present, and Kavaladze his name had surfaced in scandals about 10 years earlier because he was creating thousands of shell companies to launder money. So that he was there is quite interesting. You have to also remember Paul Manafort is there, and it's worth going back in his history and understanding his relationship to Russia, and you understand something much more is going on there. And by that I mean that Manafort has effectively been working for Vladimir Putin for years, starting around 2005.
You quote in the book. In fact, his daughter saying that they're taking blood money. Can I ask a question about Manafort? Because that was going to be my next question, and then you can go back on. I'm sorry to interrupt.
Sure.
But Manafort, I mean, clearly through the Ukraine, all that money, all the money laundering, but is that really linked to Trump at all?
I think absolutely. I think you have to go back. I mean, I think it's parallel and independent, and they join up. But one, it's worth remembering that Trump keeps saying, "Oh, Manafort only worked for me for a few weeks." Right. Well, wait just a minute. He started working together in 1980, 38 years ago. Okay, and Manafort and Roger Stone had a lobbying firm on K Street in Washington that was known as the favored lobbyist for torturers and dictators. And they took Ferdinand Marcos of the Philippines, or Jonas Savimbi, or various others, and I've interviewed Roger Stone a few times, and he sort of revels in the sleaze and saying, "Isn't it wonderful how sleazy we are?" And so the next step for Manafort was to represent effectively Vladimir Putin and help install a puppet of his as president of Ukraine, and that's how he started working for Yanukovych, and about the same time he got a condo in Trump Tower, so I think the relationships are much more than this.
That's come out
exactly, and then a lot of what Manafort did in Ukraine with Yanukovych was almost a dry run for doing it 10 years later with Trump installing a pro-Putin president in the United States.
We have a minute to go on this, and one of the things that really comes clear in your book is how corrupt our culture has gotten. Putin really infiltrated our pay-to-play, didn't he?
Absolutely. I mean, it's a really good point, and I go back well over 20 years ago. If you remember the Jack Abramoff, who was the famous scandalized lobbyist.
We've interviewed him.
Oh, great. Well, and Tom DeLay. Well, they went off to Moscow and got money there. You started seeing congressmen like Kurt Weldon from Pennsylvania, Dana Rohrabacher from California, who became known as Vladimir Putin's favorite congressman. Money started flowing into super PACs and all of that. They studied our lobbying system and our campaign finance system, and they took advantage of every pay-to-play crack in those facades that there are.
You're listening to Forensic Talk with Jim Campbell from our flagship station, WGCH Greenwich. Coming next, we'll have more Trump and the Russian mob, so stay with us. We're back with Craig Unger, author of House of Trump, House of Putin, the untold story of Donald Trump and the Russian mafia, and it is pretty incredible what he's uncovered. Let me ask you something I probably should have asked you at the start. Are you an anti-Trump guy? Do you have a bias going into this?
Well, I mean, I will be perfectly honest, and I did not vote for him. That's for sure. And I think he's a real danger to us as a democracy. I think this is the greatest national security breach imaginable. I mean, his ties to Russia are just so flagrant, and what he's been doing on their behalf is extraordinary. And I think we have to end this nightmare as soon as possible.
In fact, when I interrupted you on that meeting related to the Magnitsky-Browder bait and switch in Trump Tower, you made it a point that's really important because it was code word for lifting the sanctions. Do you think that that Trump that there was almost a deal there to lift the sanctions, which would almost seem to be treasonous?
Yes, I mean, I think he's doing whatever he can, and I haven't followed it closely enough, but I think some of the sanctions are not. He's not always implementing those deals, and I mean, you could see it from even before he was elected that at the Republican National Convention they changed the planks on the Ukraine and weakened them. So this has been going on, and we're learning more about. I think this will come out as the Mueller report is released and more indictments come down and people go to court. The sanctions do hurt Putin, and they definitely want them released. I mean, it's no good being a billionaire if you can't get money out of Russia.
Yeah, and in
that's
fact,
sort of the bottom line.
A lot of people don't realize, I think, that one of the reasons Putin seems so obsessed with Browder and Magnitsky is that Putin himself has a lot of money that he's got to keep right in Western banks that he doesn't want frozen.
Absolutely, and I think as Browder has said that Putin is the richest man in the world with about $200 billion. It's just extraordinary. And you realize that there's this whole sea of dark money, that there's been about $1 trillion in flight capital from Russia since Putin has been president, and that money needs to be laundered. So you come along, and how are they going to launder it? Well, the best way to do that is real estate, and Trump was one of the leading people.
You mentioned Mueller briefly. And I've always kind of felt this, that the Russian collusion in the election, they definitely interfered, but I'm not sure how much the Trump campaign was involved because they were so incompetent. Is it the wrong investigation, and that this stuff is what should be looked at?
You mean actual getting into money?
Getting into the money laundering.
Oh, I think they will get into money laundering, and in a lot of ways, I think that this is a blueprint of some of the things Mueller will get into. I don't know how far back they'll do it, but I mean, I say that partly because some of my stuff comes from FBI documents. So clearly, Mueller has all this stuff. There was the FBI had a task force in Budapest for several years, and they were going after the Russian mafia, specifically Mogilevich, and Mogilevich at the time was was sort of based in Budapest, and they drove him back to Moscow because Hungary has an extradition treaty with the United States and Russia does not.
Someone once told me that to understand Trump and his business practices, you have to see his taxes. Do you have that feeling?
It's quite possible, and I'm not an expert. I would go to David K. Johnston on this almost, but I'm not an expert on taxes and what they reveal. I want to know where the money comes from, and it's not clear to me whether that can be hidden as tax forms or not. But one of the big problems here is the massive number of shell companies, of limited liability corporations and so forth. Mm-hmm. And as a reporter, I can't penetrate them, and the general public can't, and you really need subpoena power for that. And that is when you get to laundering this vast amount of money, Some of this was revealed in the Panama Papers a few years ago. But there are thousands and thousands of shell companies, and it's very hard to get behind it and find out who owns all of them. One of the interesting things in the Manafort case, and this came out of the indictments against him that Mueller filed, was you could see where he laundered his money and how he did it. And Manafort was laundering his money through a company called Lucical. That's what there were many companies, but one of them was called Lucical. And independently, I figured out that was tied to Simeon Mogilevich. So one of the interesting things in this whole scandal, I think, is it's important to follow the money. And that's what you were asking earlier about the ties between Manafort and Trump and how that may work. One of the reasons Manafort is in there is he's working for Putin and Putin's oligarchs and the Russian mafia. And what the way all that works is the oligarchs have essentially seized the natural resources of the former Soviet Union. And that includes things like liquid natural gas. So the energy trade between Russia and Turkmenistan on the one hand and Ukraine on the other is enormously important. You have billions and billions of dollars changing hands and billions of dollars being skimmed from it by the Russian mafia, some of it going to Putin, some of it going to Mogilevich, some going to oligarchs like Dmitry Firtash and so forth. And they want to keep that situation, so they brought in Paul Manafort to install their favorite president, Yanukovych, as sort of a Putin puppet and keep those arrangements in place. And that's the kind of money that's been flowing into Trump Tower and Trump Organization as well.
I wonder how Manafort slept at night doing all this stuff. Really...
I don't know. One of the most interesting things was his daughters were texting back and forth about this.
Yes.
And they were horrified about it. And after the events in Maidan Square, in which dozens of people were killed, one of his daughters texted the other, that's our dad is behind all this. All his money is blood money. That's blood money.
It's really... What's the biggest single revelation to you from all this stuff?
I have to say the ties to Mogilevich and further, when I understood the ties of the Russian mafia to Putin and to Russian intelligence, it was like going through the looking glass. That was part of it. It was just, my God, that we have Russian assets in the home of the President of the United States, and he himself is doing their bidding as a Russian asset. It was a little hard to take. And I also sort of found this was one of the most lurid, sordid groups of people imaginable. And it was a world of unfathomable greed. And there was just a point at which I was writing about this party in Antalya, Turkey, with a lot of the oligarchs, where they would cruise in on first a 300-foot yacht, then a 400-foot yacht, and a 500-foot yacht. And the yachts, one of the yachts, the bar stools were upholstered in the hides of 29 different endangered species. And when you unpack that, I wrote that sentence, and then I sort of unpacked it for a moment, and you realize some multi-billionaire is searching out endangered species so he can upholster his bar stools. And the level of decadence just was astounding to me, because meanwhile, the staffers were negotiating for human trafficking of young girls, 16-year-old girls, to come over as escorts. And it's just sort of that's Donald Trump's world. That's the world of oligarchs. Those are the friends of the President of the United States. And I was just sort of horrified with how far we have fallen.
In fact, I wanted to go right there next, which is people don't know who Semyon Mogilevich is. and I want to have you talk a little bit about him. But according to your book, he's sold enriched uranium to terrorists. He sold weapons to Al Qaeda. He has a private army that kills, murders folks, into drugs, into hookers, into human trafficking, and of course he's what you call the #1 money laundering expert.
Right, and the President of the United States has been laundering his money.
This guy is absolutely evil, right?
Oh, it's just extraordinary, and some of this is hiding in plain sight, as I say, because when I was researching the Russian Mafia, I mean, you see some of this stuff I write about them was in the Washington Post or the New York Times, but never really tied to the relationship. Was not really tied to Trump, and so when I say it's hiding in plain sight, that's what I mean.
I want to talk about another guy that has always kind of blown me away. This guy Felix Sater worked for Bayrock, and he was a convicted criminal and an informant for the FBI and the CIA. But you can talk about him, but also I've seen the video of a Trump deposition where he says he wouldn't recognize Felix Sater if he saw him in a room, even though Felix Sater worked for him and had an office, 2 floors down from him.
Exactly. Felix Sater is one of my favorite characters in the book. He's sort of the international man of mystery. And to be honest, I think I have certainly not answered all the questions concerning him. And as you say, we know he had a double life in that he was convicted of 2 felonies. One was a pump and dump stock scam on Wall Street. The other was stabbing a guy in the face with a broken margarita glass in a way that required over 100 stitches. And then he became a FBI cooperator and for the CIA and the Defense Intelligence Agency as well. And claims to have done all these heroic acts. But I've wondered, is he really have a triple life? And is he really still working for the Russian Mafia? And his father has been tied to the Russian Mafia in court documents. Felix Sater, I've talked to him several times. He was he was part of Bayrock. He was the managing director of Bayrock, which is on the 24th floor of Trump Tower, and he would frequently went upstairs and pop his head in, as he said under oath, to Donald Trump. He also accompanied Trump's children, Donald Jr. and Ivanka, to Moscow on their first trip to Moscow. So he was their escort and guide on that trip, and he claims to have seated Ivanka in President Putin's chair in the Kremlin. And you've got to be well connected to do that.
Yeah. Also, I think you said that it's illegal or whatever in a real estate, in the contracts and stuff, not to disclose someone's criminal background, right? And that Trump would have known about his criminal background of his partner?
Exactly. And this is one of the rare times when I think you can get inside Donald Trump's head, because it's in a sworn deposition, and he's asked about Sater's criminal background, and he says, well, I've heard about it and I'll look into it. But he doesn't, and he continues to do business with them. And they continue to do business in a building known as Trump Soho in downtown New York. And that was developed by Bayrock, and it's been a fiasco. They took the Trump name off of it.
Can you tell me why that was a fiasco? And is there illegal stuff that can be tied directly out of Soho?
Well, there are court cases going on now, and just to give you 2 examples. One is some of the financing came through a company known as the FL Group, which is an Icelandic corporation that was famous for laundering money from Russia. So there you have that kind of money going in to help finance the development of the Trump Soho. Then, once it was built, the condos were then sold, and again, we have allegations of money laundering in their court cases going on about that. So, it certainly appears to be money laundering, and this is sort of typical of what happened in Trump Towers all over the world. There were roughly 40 Trump Towers all over the world, and while I'm focusing on the ones mostly in the United States, the same was going on in Panama and all over
And you trace Russian money in all those 40, or you?
Well, not all of them. No, I mean, to be honest, I ran out of time. But when we talk about the number 1,300 units,
mm-hmm.
that refers only to Trump's American properties.
I was wondering about that.
And so there's roughly again as many. It's quite likely in his overseas properties as well.
Now, even during the campaign at the beginning, they were trying to get a deal together for Trump Moscow. What's been the deal there? Why hasn't that happened?
Right. Well, and that's true. In fact, they were trying as late as, I believe, July of 2016, which was well into the presidential campaign. You know, I mean, I think there's a very good reason it never went through in Moscow, because if you look at the way Trump does business, what the great amenity he offers investors that no one else offers, or that not everyone offers, is money laundering. And if you want to launder your money, you don't want to do it in Russia. You want to get it out of Russia. That's the whole point.
Fascinating. What is this Chabad that you talk about, the Jewish umbrella for Putin? You call, what was that? What is that?
Right. Well, I happen to be Jewish as well, and I was a little horrified by all this. But I think it's not the first time, but the politicians have used religion as a political ploy to serve their agenda. And when I looked at Felix Sater and Bayrock, and you sort of do a deep dive in a Google search, you keep finding that Felix was voted Man of the Year for Chabad in Port Washington, Long Island. And I dug down deeper, and the founder of Bayrock was the big contributor to it. So it's almost as if he's giving money to the synagogue so that Felix will be Man of the Year. And that everyone in Bayrock was affiliated with Chabad. And I noticed that the Grand Rabbi of Moscow was now Beryl Lazar, was also affiliated with Chabad, and he knew the Felix Sater's rabbi, and that Putin had backed Chabad and some of the oligarchs, including Roman Abramovich and Lev Leviev, both of whom are tied to Leviev is tied to Bayrock as a financier. He's on all their promotional literature, and Abramovich is good friends with Jared Kushner, as is Leviev.
Can't make this stuff. Our final forensic segment, the Trump-Putin bromance. Final segment with Craig Unger. He exposed Russian mob links to Trump. Let me ask you now on this bromance that Putin has brilliantly orchestrated. Has it ended up backfiring because so much of this stuff has come out that Trump doesn't have the leverage to provide what Putin wanted, sanctions lifting, etc.?
Well, that's quite possible. And I mean, I've heard rumblings that they're getting sick of him, and they're exposing too much liability, the Russians. But I think they've gotten a lot out of him as it is. They really have. I mean, and just to frame this in very broad terms of what is it that Putin wants and what is he getting, Putin's always referred to the end of the Soviet Union as the greatest catastrophe in world history. And since then, one by one, all the East Bloc nations that were part of the Soviet Empire have been joining NATO. And he really wanted to put a stop to that and to dissolve or attack the Western alliance. And I think that's what all this is part of, and I call it a virtual world war, in which they're not using bombs, bullets, or boots on the ground. It's war by other means, using cyber warfare, using disinformation, and all sorts of weapons like that, hacking. And one of the weapons is the Russian Mafia. That's one weapon in Putin's arsenal. So that's sort of how I see it. And if you look at what it's done to the Western alliance, one of the things that's remarkable about what Trump has done is he really is ruining the Western alliance. And I think most of us are too young, even I am, because the Western alliance started in 1945, and we forget that, Europe was a disaster area with two massive world wars before 1945. And we came in with the Marshall Plan and built up democratic institutions and market economies, and we've got great trading partners and military allies and great places to vacation as well. And the Western Alliance was just astoundingly successful. Why do we want to dissolve that? Putin wants to dissolve it, and Trump is helping him. And I think you've seen right-wing anti-immigrant movements
Yes.
being fueled by Putin all over Europe.
And in fact, you made a great point in the book that just since he's been in office, he undermined the Western Alliance, relations with Canada, Mexico, trade wars, anti-immigration. So in a sense, was this almost a silent takeover of the U.S.?
I think it was, and I mean, I found it. I mean, that was the. You know, I don't finish the first chapter until I finish the whole book, and I try to synthesize and say what are my conclusions, and I end up saying there's a Russian asset in the White House, and he may even be a knowledgeable one, who's actively working for them, but they own him. He was $4 billion in debt when they came to his aid. They made him rich again. They helped him win the presidency. He owes them everything, and he has delivered on an awful lot.
So you think Putin, in a way, owns him. Let me ask this. Suppose if he has this compromat that everybody thinks he has, this compromising material, is Putin in a position ever to use it? Or, in other words, how does Trump puts himself in this job, and he's got all this blackmail against him, and whether it's sex tapes or whatever, is he not worried about this stuff coming out?
Well, again, I can't get into his mind, but, sometimes compromise is best when it's not used, and when it's not revealed, and it can be used against him without Putin showing it. And a good example is what happened in Hungary, where Viktor Orban was sort of a liberal anti-Putin guy, and in 2008 he switches completely and becomes a wonderful friend of Vladimir Putin's best friend. What happened behind the scenes? Well, I tell in the book that the Russian Mafia had delivered 1 million Deutschmarks to Orban in a payoff years ago, and they videotaped that, and they had that as compromise, and it appears they may have used it against him to get Orban to become a Putin backer.
How do you see all this ending?
Badly.
Impeachment, criminal charges when he's out of office, war. What do you see happening?
Right. There are too many variables to give a final thing, but we're on a collision course, and it can only end two ways. One, with him being forced out, which I think and hope will happen, and I think the Democrats have to take over the House, impeachment has to start, and then I think we're going to see huge amounts of stuff come flooding out when Mueller delivers, if he's not fired first, or Trump will perhaps fire Mueller incrementally by firing Rosenstein first, but he'll do stuff that are extra constitutional to try to sabotage the investigation. And he may, for all I know, he may start a war somewhere. There may be a Reichstag fire-like event. Anything can happen. I think of him almost as a trapped rat who's going to do anything he can to escape.
I was going to ask.
The walls are closing in on him.
Yeah. Do you think that he would do something irrational? I look at all these folks who had said that he's mentally ill and he's going to nuke North Korea, but he's actually moved towards peace in North Korea. You think that if he's backed into a corner, he would do something nuts?
I think he could, quite possibly. I put nothing beyond him. He's very impulsive, and he often ignores the advice of his closest advisors. So nothing really would surprise me, but I think he is being trapped. He could, if the Democrats win Congress, he could just say, look, I can't get anything done. And for all I know, he could walk away. And cut his losses.
That's what Barbara Ress says, who worked for him, Rand. Is there something that's always concerned me is there is so much stuff, and it's complex, and it's hard for the public that needs to be digesting simple bites. Is it possible that he's done so much stuff that you can't get your arms around it?
Oh, absolutely. Well, I in writing this book, I did not run out of material. I ran out of time. I had a deadline, and I had to make it. But there is, and part of it was keeping stuff out to save the poor reader, because it is so complicated. There, what I have in the book is the tip of the iceberg, and
Wow.
This is happening in Hungary. It's happening in Estonia. It's happening all over Europe, in France, and the Brexit. You can go on and on like this. So I think this really is a massive assault by Russia. People ask if they're meddling in our elections. The meddling is not a strong enough word. This is an assault on our sovereignty to sabotage an American presidential election.
It's amazing, too, is that Russia's GNP is like the size of Spain or Greece or, countries that have no consequence. We're down to the last minute. Did this take a fair guts on your part? Are you worried about threats from Russian mob figures, the Trump administration, the Trump organization? Have you had any pushback?
I have not had much pushback, and I would be worried if I went to Russia. I kind of feel safe in the United States, to be honest. What's interesting is that people have come out of the woodwork, including people in the Russian Mafia, and I've been talking to them, and they have very interesting things to say.
Well, now, is Trump going to tweet it? Has he tweeted about this? Is he, because when you get close to finance, he always seems to freak out.
Right. No, I think he doesn't want a spotlight on this,
Yes.
and I think he's afraid if he does, that will open things. I think as the Mueller investigation unveils, I think a lot more of this will come out.
All right. Thanks to Craig Unger. You got to read this book, Revelatory: House of Trump, House of Putin, the untold story of Donald Trump and the Russian Mafia. Next week, we have New York Times reporter David Kirkpatrick on the Arab Spring and why it failed. Thanks to Craig again. See everybody next Monday on Forensic Talk with Jim Campbell.